Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood city planner and research director for California YIMBY, where we are very much hard at work trying to make California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. Welcome back to the Abundance Podcast. In this episode, I chat with Emily Hamilton. Emily is a senior research fellow and director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where she researches urban economics and land use policy. In this episode, we discuss the exciting reforms adopted in Montana this year, why small lots matter big time, and how to legalize accessory dwelling units the right way, as in a way that actually gets housing built. While I have you here, if you haven't already, please take a minute to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps us to expand our reach and bring new folks in. And of course, we'd love to hear from you what you're thinking about the show and who you want to hear from next. With that, on to the show. Hey, Emily, it's good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Nolan. Great to talk with you.
In my day-to-day now, I am pretty relentlessly focused on California. It's an exciting place to be. We're on the leading edge of some of these reforms, but something that I love chatting with you and your colleagues at Mercatus about are all of the exciting things that are happening across the country, especially over the last 6 months in particular. California gets a lot of the attention, but I think you all have put out some recent work sort of revealing like there are a lot of different reform options and a lot of different reforms being adopted. Any in particular that you're especially excited about?
Yeah, that's one thing I really like about our team here at Mercatus is we get to focus on the country as a whole, and in particular, states and localities that maybe not a lot of organizations, especially national organizations, are focused on. I think the most exciting state from the past session, which you and I both did a little bit of work on, was Montana, that adopted a big package of housing bills that hopefully will do a lot to help increase housing supply and improve affordability in a state that's really seen drastically rising house prices and rents before the pandemic, but even more so after.
Yeah, so let's dive right into it. I think a lot of folks are fascinated by Montana. Setting the table a little bit, right? I think it's increasingly clear that, the California housing crisis, and to a lesser extent, the West Coast housing crisis, is being exported across the Mountain West. Folks are moving to places like Montana and Idaho and Utah and Arizona for affordable housing. But these places are bumping right up against the constraints that made California so expensive. Is there anything in particular? Why Montana? Right. That's one of the questions I have, because it seems like this was a region-wide issue, but Montana really sort of embraced zoning reform. Do you have a sense for why Montana led on the issue?
Well, I think Governor Gianforte really prioritized it, and that was essential to going into the legislative session with the energy behind housing that happened. But prior to his focus on the issue, there were also legislators from both parties that had introduced important housing bills that didn't pass, that helped lay the groundwork. As we've seen many times in California, something might not succeed the first time it's introduced, but the next session, it might have a better chance thanks to the debate that already happened among many of the legislators. I also think that the task force to work on housing policy that Governor Gianforte appointed helped create some of that momentum. And it's a model that I would recommend to policymakers in other states who want to help lay the groundwork for housing reform ahead of a legislative session, is to appoint people both from inside the legislature and from outside of it to have some ideas that are shovel ready in terms of getting bills introduced.
Yeah, let's talk about the mechanics of that a little bit, because this is a real challenge that I think we face in California and everywhere else, is that, legislative ideas can sort of come along in an ad hoc way, or unless you have a legislator who really is like, I am going to, like, this is my bill idea, I'm going to do the research on my end, I'm going to do the policy development. Things can come together in an ad hoc way, and then over the course of the legislative cycle, the bill gets changed quite a bit. I was really intrigued by this working group model of going into the legislative session with, like, here are recommendations and ideas. I guess I wonder, like, yeah, I mean, what was the composition of that working group? Like, how did the work, you were on that, as I understand, you were in that working group. Like, how did the workflow occur? Because it seems like this, I'm with you. I think this is actually a really interesting model for especially states that are dealing with this for the first time, where they're like, we haven't had this conversation. Like California, it's like every debate is like an extension of something that's been happening for the last 5 years. But like in a place like Montana, they were like, we're approaching the issue for the first time. How do we tackle it? Could you talk a little bit more about the workflow of the working group?
Sure. And yeah, as you say, I'm not an unbiased observer to this. And just one caveat, I think this task force model was particularly effective in Montana, where the legislature only meets every other year. It's a very part-time legislature with not a lot of staff resources. So it's a very different landscape than California with a full-time legislature and lots of staff. But the composition of the task force was pretty big. It was, I think, 24 members. Four of those were Republican and Democratic legislators from the House and the Senate. There were a lot of industry groups represented, a lot of state agencies were represented, as well as local policymakers. And then subject matter experts like myself and advocates from both the right and the left, from state-based think tanks that were really influential in helping this package be prioritized and helping shape the content of it.
Yeah, so let's let's talk a little bit about the content of it. Yeah, there was a lot of good stuff in there. I mean, this is some of the work that you all been doing at Mercatus that I think is great. It's like the menu of options. There's a lot of different ways to approach state level housing reform. Yeah, let's talk about some of what was in there. Maybe starting with the stuff that is very near and dear to both of our hearts, but didn't pass: minimum lot size reform. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
So the task force recommendation that I was most enthusiastic about was a cap on local minimum lot size requirements that was introduced in legislation, but ultimately didn't make it out of committee. And the task force recommendation, and also what was introduced in the bill, was to cap local minimum lot size requirements at 2,500 square feet. And this was based on a lot of Montana localities having a very large number of 2,500, or rather 5,000 square foot lots that are 50 by 100 and could easily be subdivided into two 2,500 square foot lots. And this small lot development model is something that we've seen work really well, particularly in the Houston case that you and I are both big fans of, as something that works very well for home builders and home buyers and can deliver a large amount of both infill and small lot greenfield construction.
Yeah, I mean, I was extremely excited about the minimum lot size reform. I actually that was the bill that I came out to testify with you on out to Helena, which was just a great experience. But I think it did. I think it was the opening salvo in a series of bill discussions that became easier for the next two, which we'll talk about, I guess, a little more in a minute. But I mean, for folks who maybe don't know about minimum lot sizes, right? I mean, this is literally a local government saying you are not allowed to build a single family home unless you have so much land. And now in context where there's not water and sewer and you're reliant on well water or septic systems, it might be appropriate to require maybe a half acre or an acre, depending on local conditions. But what we're talking about here really is places that have water and sewer, and the government's basically just saying you're not allowed to have a home unless you can afford 5,000 square feet of land, 7,500 square feet of land. And the trouble in a place like Montana, where so much land is under public ownership or under some form of conservation easement or is used for high value agriculture, there's not a lot of developable land. I mean, we think of Montana and we think, oh, Montana is just vast and empty. They have unlimited land. What's the problem here? Just keep sprawling out and out and out. I mean, I think two things on this. One, a lot of that land just simply isn't ready to be developed for the reasons I just said. But then two, I think folks were like, well, we don't want that to be the only way that we're fulfilling our housing demand. That said, we know that many people prefer a detached single family home. You know, I think YIMBYs, we often, understandably, given like the fact that we are growing mostly out of places like San Francisco or New York, spend a lot of time talking about legalizing multifamily. But the thing that's interesting to me about minimum lot sizes is we can say, yeah, we can actually fulfill most Americans' preference for a detached single family home, but in a way that's purely infill and is much more affordable, right? I mean, small lot homes and townhouses.
Yeah, absolutely. And this small lot single family development has some advantages from the broader landscape of housing construction in the US, in that it's easier to finance relative to a condo building, both on the construction side, and then also for home buyers, you can get lower interest loans for a fee simple house relative to condos, and it just comes with some fewer headaches in the delivery process.
Yeah, it's funny when every now and then I'll tweet out a picture of like a Houston townhouse, which they're called townhouses, but they're actually, they have like little tiny absolute bare minimum side setbacks. And people will ask like, why not just have them be attached? And I mean, I think there's two things. One is any sort of condo or shared ownership just becomes slightly more of a governance headache. And I think that that's a like cost worth eating if it gets you a big condo building or it gets you like beautiful amenities. But if it's like, oh, okay, I just now share a wall, like you kind of gain nothing, but you get this governance headache. And then two, this is something I heard from Houston developers and realtors. They were like, we're selling a lot of these to people who are moving from suburban and rural areas, and they still just have a cultural like preference for a detached single family home, even if it's like this absurdly minimum, you know, air pocket between the two buildings. And you know, like sure, okay, maybe the next generation of maybe their kids who grew up in a place like Houston are more you know, tolerant of living in a townhouse or an apartment. But I guess to me it reminded me of like, hey, you know, like urbanization is like a process, right? Like the first generation of people that move to the city, like if they can afford it, are still going to want to pretend like they're living this suburban rural lifestyle in some regards. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I personally don't think I have any hangups about attached housing, and we both live in attached housing, and it's just fine. But I think a lot of Americans and probably a lot of people who live in Montana just have a maybe a vision of themselves living in a detached single family house that can still be provided at relatively high densities if it's on a small lot.
Yeah, right, right. Oh, I mean, it's a good compromise. And I was talking about this with Bill Fulton, where you know it starts to change the way people engage with their city. You know, he was saying like uh, people move to Houston, maybe from a Texas small town or a Texas suburb. They get their postage stamp townhouse, right? And then they start realizing, oh, if I want to spend some time in something like a yard, I have to go to a park. Or, you know, oh, okay, like if I want a little bit more space to like, you know, just lounge around and study, I have to go out to a cafe. And it starts to slowly develop, I think, habits of urban living that I think are positive. I mean, of course, like that's me like taking my like just build lots of housing hat off and like putting my urban living is good hat on. I mean, the beauty of it is that even if you don't want that, like a townhouse is just an effective way to build a lot of housing units in a place where land prices are high and demand is growing. You know, so that Montana bill died, unfortunately. Like all good bill ideas, I'm sure it will come back. But minimum lot size reforms seem to be spreading across the country. I mean, so I was just reading about, I believe now Dallas and Austin are both considering reducing minimum lot sizes. Are you seeing any other action on this across the country?
Yeah, the Vermont legislature passed a requirement for localities to allow a certain level of small lot development. And as you point out, this only applies in places that have the wet utilities that are needed to serve relatively dense construction. But in Texas, I think the Austin and Dallas proposals are both probably inspired in part by a state bill that was introduced and again didn't pass. But the state bill was inspired by the Houston minimum lot size reforms, and would have legalized all the way down to 1,400 square foot lots as Houston allows. And I think policymakers in Austin and Dallas saw this as maybe some inspiration for what they could do locally that maybe at least last session wasn't politically feasible among the legislature as a whole, but might be something that's really attractive to residents of those big Texas cities, as it's proven to be in Houston.
It certainly can't hurt that this isn't like, this is coming from Houston, which is, a pretty good comp for Dallas, but also it's not like far left California. Like, oh, what could possibly, it's funny because that's a feature of the Montana advocacy is these reforms were being framed by Kendall Cotton, who absolutely deserves mentioning here, because I mean, he runs the Frontier Institute. He was pivotal in getting a lot of this passed, but I think what he and Henry Kriegel at AFP Montana actually figured out was, frame this as, let's get rid of California style zoning. Because I think in Montana, as in so much of the Mountain West, there's this anxiety of like, we don't want to become California. We don't want to become this place that's extremely unaffordable and exclusionary, but also we don't want to become this place that's like LA, where every flat developable piece of land gets turned into sprawl subdivisions. And I think they cracked the code, and they, I have the flyer here because I asked Kendall to mail me one because I was so tickled by it. Like, in California style zoning in Montana, yeah, it strikes me that as a more market oriented center, your team at Mercatus, you all spend a lot of time talking to folks in red states. Do you want to talk more about that like messaging YIMBY in places that maybe aren't terribly concerned about normal YIMBY bugbears like climate change or racial equity? How do you frame that?
Sure. Yeah. As you point out, Kendall and the Frontier Institute did a masterful job of messaging for a Montana audience. Yeah. Well, I think in some ways it's easier to explain housing abundance and the YIMBY agenda to a right of center audience, because this is a straightforward area where deregulation will improve the quality of life for the typical American household by making it possible for more people to live in the city of their choice at prices that are more affordable to their household's budget. So it's a pretty straightforward property rights libertarian argument. There are certainly tons of reasons to support housing affordability for people across the political spectrum, and specific reasons that this agenda might be attractive to people farther on the left as well. But when you start talking about local land use regulations and zoning among a small government audience, it's often pretty easy to gin up enthusiasm for reducing regulations and allowing people to have a lifestyle that fits their own preferences.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Of course, this is maybe a whole separate conversation, but I mean, you were an early blogger on market urbanism, which I think charted out a lot of contemporary YIMBY ideas. You with Stephen Smith and Adam Hangles, and thinking through some of this, and making this case of like, hey, this is kind of people talk about like the benefits of deregulation or removing rules. Like this is kind of a fairly straightforward case of that. You have rules that literally make it illegal to build affordable housing, especially in high opportunity transit rich areas, like, and forces sprawl that, you know, is potentially environmentally and fiscally unsustainable. Hello, like here's your like low hanging fruit. It's always amusing when I still meet libertarians who, you know, have tortured themselves into theories of like, oh well, like zoning is a collective property right, which, you know, I know is a theory that you hate. This notion of like, oh, like my neighborhood looking the same is this implicit property right that was granted to me by the government when I bought my home and it was zoned R1, and by taking that away from me, the government is taking away my property rights. And it's very like tortured view of the relationship between like zoning and property, because I would have thought, well, telling someone they can't build an ADU on their property or telling them they can't subdivide their home to a duplex is like the real transgression on property rights.
Right. Yeah. And there certainly are plenty of people on the right who have a more small c conservative approach to the issue and favor neighborhoods that stay the same over time and don't allow for redevelopment and growth as demand conditions change. But yeah, in general, I think it's a very clear place where having stronger individual, not collective property rights facilitates a market that can serve more people better.
Yeah, returning to the Montana case, I think another reform that was really exciting that you've been tracking is ADUs. What happened with ADUs in Montana?
Yeah, Montana became the ninth state to legalize accessory dwelling units statewide. And with some of its bills, including the minimum lot size bill that we talked about, Montana policymakers were really charting new ground in terms of state limits on local zoning regulations. But in the case of ADUs, Montana policymakers had the advantage of learning from the West Coast experience with accessory dwelling units and seeing the constellation of rules changes over time that have made it possible for ADUs to be built in large numbers. And based on that experience, they got to implement the best practices of legalizing accessory dwelling units from the get-go. So the Montana law not only requires localities to allow homeowners to add these accessory dwelling units, but it also requires that localities don't have rules in place for owner occupancy requirements, which we've seen are a big deal in whether or not ADUs are feasible to build. It preempts parking requirements for ADUs and requires them to be permitted through a by right process.
Yeah, I mean, you have a new report out, a taxonomy of state accessory dwelling unit laws, and you know, a line I've been sort of trying to slip into my talks is there are a lot of bad ways to legalize ADUs, and there's really only a handful of good ways to legalize ADUs. And I think one of those features that you flagged that I want to dive in a little bit more is owner occupancy requirements. It strikes me that these have been a standard feature of ADU laws until recently. This is now, of course, a big fight this year in California. In 2020, we removed this requirement for ADUs, and I think that there's pretty good evidence that that's been key to the ADU boom in California. 976 would renew this. Why is an owner occupancy requirement such a barrier to ADU production?
Cole Peterson, in his book, The Backdoor Revolution, gives a really good explanation of why these owner occupancy requirements are so burdensome. But basically, what they say is that homeowners who add an ADU to their property can only rent it out as long as they live in either the main house or the ADU themselves. Otherwise, it has to be an underused unit that a household can't live in. And this ADUs are, especially in high cost markets, are not a trivial investment to make. They cost a lot of money to add to a house. And so to tell a homeowner, you're going to make this really big investment, but that means that, say your job takes you to another state for a couple years and you wanted to still own your house because you plan to come back, but you want to be able to rent it out for 2 years while you're gone. That ADU is not going to be adding much value to your house in that case. You're removing investors as a potential buyer of your property because they aren't going to be able to rent out both the ADU and the main house. And it also makes these ADUs harder to finance because an owner occupancy requirement means that the ADU is not good collateral for a bank because obviously were the bank to foreclose, the ADU couldn't be rented out because the bank can never be an owner occupant. And then maybe most importantly, these requirements mean that ADUs don't add as much to the appraised value of the house as they would without these rules because it limits the types of comps that appraisers can use to come up with what they think the value of the house is. And it leads to them to view ADUs more like an extra bedroom than a totally additional, potentially income producing housing unit.
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought a lot about the appraisal piece. I mean, I know the financing is a huge barrier. I mean, just to restate what you said, I mean, right, the idea here is that bank, if a homeowner doesn't have home equity, so they don't have housing wealth, they're going to have to go to a bank and get a loan, and they need some sort of collateral. The collateral could be, something to basically say to the bank, you are going to get paid back no matter what. If it's an ADU that they know they're going to be able to rent almost no matter what, then banks are pretty happy with that, right? But if it's an ADU where if something might change and the homeowner no longer lives there, they suddenly can't rent it out. The bank is saying we can't be confident that we're going to get our money back, and so they just won't lend to ADUs where an owner occupancy requirement is involved, right? And I mean, I'm restating what you're saying, but I think it's just important because these are owner occupancy requirements are so common, and I think folks often say, well, we need this. I think folks say a few things. One, they say, well, having an owner occupancy requirement will guarantee that the landlord is on site, and so they can regulate the behavior of the tenant. Or two, we want to stop investors from buying up homes and building these ADUs. What do you say to those two sort of, I think, steelman arguments for owner occupancy requirements?
Yeah, well said on the financing piece. I mean, if the purpose of legalizing accessory dwelling units is to make it possible for them to be built and for more people to have access to this relatively low cost rental unit that ADUs often are, investors are one of the ideal people to build them because they have some expertise and capital to get it done relative to homeowners who aren't don't have those same skills. But I think in the ADU policy discussion, a lot of people see them as maybe kind of like a charming inefficiency in the housing market, as something that's more of a community built type of housing unit, which is lovely when that does happen, but it's just not likely feasible to see it done in the types of numbers that we need to address our housing shortage when those owner occupancy requirements are making them a lot less attractive to build.
Yeah. No, I think it's any state or local policymaker or planner considering adopting an ADU ordinance. I think this is a really important thing to pay attention to. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the other barriers. I mean, owner occupancy is the big one. I think I often see impact fees that can be quite high that can discourage homeowners from building these. Are there any others that you want to flag? Because I know you've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I just had an experience where I gave a talk in a region that, in an unspecified region in the Northeast, where they said, oh, we all legalized ADUs in the 80s. And then you crack open their code and it's like owner occupancy requirement, special use requirement, special use permit requirement, $100,000 impact fee. And you're like, Okay, but did you really legalize ADUs? Like, is there anything else you want to flag for folks who are considering legalizing ADUs in their community?
Yeah, parking requirements are another big one, especially because in a lot of neighborhoods, the natural place to put ADUs is in existing garages, and converting that garage that already has the foundation and structure in place um, as a relatively low cost way to add a housing unit to a property just makes a lot of sense. But if, say, a locality requires two off-street parking spaces for a single family house, and then an additional one or two parking spaces for an accessory dwelling unit that's going to be built in a garage, you're likely making it impossible to provide, three or four off-street parking spots on the site of an existing single family house with those requirements.
Right, right. And I would contend that neighborhood quality of life is not going to be improved by having a giant surface lot behind every single family home. But that's just I'm a
Or in
filthy
front.
or in front. Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Just having a bunch of cars parked in front of every. No, and I think there's pretty good evidence too that suggests. I mean, we know that like the number one determinant of how people get around is, do they have an off-street parking space, at their place of residence and their place of work. And so, it's funny because we mandate these parking, we mandate off-street parking, and then we are like, oh, the new development caused traffic. And it's like, well, actually, if you just give people choice, in many cases people will say like, yeah, actually I would prefer a cheaper unit without an off-street parking space. And in many cases they either forego owning a car altogether, or they have one car that is not a huge additional marginal burden on the on-street capacity, which of course you should be managing. Yeah, okay, I'm going to resist the urge to go down the parking requirement rabbit hole, as I know we both want to. Anything else on ADUs? I mean, what's on the horizon here? One of the things that really excites me is like building economies of scale. So I think it was really important for a big state like California to legalize these first, because we now effectively have like, or not first, but legalize them in a meaningful way early on in this process. Because we now have a huge, I mean, I joke about this in my Atlantic piece on this stuff. You pull up to any intersection in LA and there will be like 3 signs, like free divorce consultation, low cost like pool cleaning, and then like free ADU consultation. And you're like, that's how you've done something right. But so like it excites me that like we now have this on the West Coast. Washington, Oregon, and California have all legalized ADUs. Montana is now in the mix. I think we're seeing bills introduced in almost every Western state. Some of this action is happening in the Northeast. What's on the frontier for ADU legalization that excites you?
Yeah, well, my colleagues Salim Firth and Eli Khan just published a brief that kind of reviews the 2023 legislative sessions in those states that have already wrapped up. And by far the biggest number of land use preemption bills that were introduced have to do with ADUs. As I said, they're the most prevalent way that state governments have set limits on local zoning rules so far. So I think this is the place of lowest hanging fruit for states that have not yet set any limits on the extent of local zoning authority to do so. The West Coast states and Montana now have very strong ADU laws, but the other 5 states that have legalized them all have room to improve conditions for making it easier to build ADUs. And then all the other states that haven't adopted ADU legalization, I think that's probably the easiest place for their legislatures to step in and limit the extent to which localities can block new housing construction.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is something we should have addressed early on, but I think it's worth returning to. Why do ADUs at the state level? I think a lot of folks say, okay, zoning is a local power. Like there are going to be slight variations in local conditions to where let the locals write their own ADU ordinance. Like, why do this at the state level? Maybe even relative to other zoning reforms.
Yeah, well, one thing that I've seen in New Hampshire, which is one of the states with a relatively weak ADU law, is that localities tend to legalize exactly the bare minimum of what the state requires. Um, and I think that's for a lot of reasons, one of which is that's like the path of least resistance, rather than really considering local conditions and what would make sense in your community. They can just say, oh, we're going to do exactly what the state has told us we must do. Um, and then accessory dwelling unit ordinances are pretty common at the local level, I think, because they are the smallest step that any level of government can take to legalize more housing construction. And for the same reason, they're attractive at the state level as a way to dip a toe in the waters of rolling back zoning regulations that are standing in the way of construction.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think too, I mean, I think that other piece of it is, there's kind of only one right way to legalize ADUs on most margins that matter, right? And like a good ADU in one jurisdiction, a good ADU ordinance in one jurisdiction is probably going to be a good one in another jurisdiction. I mean, there isn't
Mhm.
really a lot of variation in local conditions that would shape what these things should look like. And I would flag too, even here in California, where we have probably the most robust state intervention on ADUs, jurisdictions can still set like design standards for those ADUs. There's still like actually quite a lot of flexibility, more so than in many other developed countries. If you want that ADU to be Spanish colonial or mid-century modern, like go for it. Just set objective design rules, and that a reasonable person can read and interpret and promptly get their permits for, and you're good to go, right? I mean, yeah. ADUs, we know them, we love them. I want to talk about some of these other exciting things that happened in Montana. I think another big one that's low-hanging fruit is allowing housing development in commercial zones. So this was
Mhm.
SB 245. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And this is one where Montana legislators are more on the cutting edge. I think it's likely that this will be an area where the legislature might come back in future years and strengthen exactly what must be allowed in these commercial zones. But what the law does is require localities of a certain population in Montana to reform their commercial zones that right now might allow only retail or office uses to allow multifamily housing as well. And it sets a limit of one parking spot requirement for each of those new housing units. And as you say, the this is another place where the politics of land use reform are relatively easy. Many communities across the U.S. have sites like dead strip malls, other underutilized commercial sites that no one is supporting the status quo. So these locations are often eyesores. They are not contributing a lot to local tax rolls, and they're not in anyone's backyard. So they're an easy place to allow new multifamily housing to be built. So Montana is now one state that has legalized that, as well as California and Florida. The one thing that's interesting about all of these Montana bills is they are very clean in terms of their objective is to legalize more housing at lower prices. So they're not serving, a lot of masters in terms of um, housing subsidies or labor or environmental standards. So that's one thing that I think will be interesting to see how these bills play out in different political climates.
Yeah, I mean, when I first looked at a couple of these Montana bills, I honestly thought I was looking at the bill summary, and I was trying to figure out how like Montana legislative legislature website works. But yeah, I mean, folks
That's
who,
short.
yeah, folks who have not like read through the YIMBY bills in Montana should go check them out. It's yeah, it's like jurisdictions have to allow residential in commercial areas, no parking above blah blah blah. Okay, you're good. Bye bye. And coming from a place like California, where I mean, for the politics are much more complex here. There are considerations about affordability requirements and labor requirements and da da da. And I think we walk that path to make sure that we're navigating that while still getting bills passed. But there was almost this blue sky quality to policymaking in Montana that was like kind of startling and very cool. You mentioned the Florida case. This was another one that I think kind of flew under the radar. Do you want to talk a little bit about what happened in Florida?
Unfortunately, I can't speak much to the politics behind that one. But the Florida law legalizes multifamily housing again in localities' commercial zones, with the requirement that a certain percentage, I think 40% of the units, are income restricted to households earning 120% of their area median income or less. So that's a high requirement in terms of the number of units that have to be income restricted, but quite generous on the income side. I think that this bill was supported by light tech developers
Mm.
as something that would open up new opportunities for their business model. So I don't know to what extent it will be useful for people building other types of housing, but if it makes new opportunities for people who are following a certain model for income restricted housing at the least, that's great.
Yeah, no, I was impressed by that too, the 120% AMI. I mean, I do think, essentially it's workforce housing, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's housing for typical working families. It's probably at or slightly below market rate. And of course, folks who want more affordable housing will say, well, it could be lower. Sure, but I think it's an AMI threshold that works, that is financially feasible without a subsidy, right? And
Mhm.
so like I think once you start getting down to 80% or 60% AMI, you better have some pretty good sweeteners in there, or you're basically going to block housing. But we can have a whole separate conversation about IZ, which I know is certainly something you've done a lot of awesome research on. Um, Going through some more of this Montana stuff, I mean, a big one that I think got people really excited was SB 323, allowing duplexes in all single family home neighborhoods. Uh, Same as in California. I mean, we passed a version like this, SB 9, which allows duplexes or small lot splits statewide. Of course, we passed this, and the immediate reaction was jurisdictions basically use what power the law gave them to adopt standards, either out of malice or incompetence, to put it maybe ungenerously. Many jurisdictions just didn't implement or adopted ordinances actively trying to undermine it. But I think these changes are at least symbolically important in that they're saying it's no longer appropriate for local governments to completely ban multifamily in the vast majority of residential areas. I'm curious. I mean, do you see this playing out, SB 323 playing out differently in Montana than the SB 9 experience, or kind of what's your general thought on that? Because I think you and I have had this conversation before. A lot of the missing middle upzonings have been a little bit underwhelming relative to ADUs or mid-rise corridor upzonings. What's it going to take, you think, to make these types of reforms work?
Yeah, well, the Montana law does close some doors to loopholes that localities might have tried to exploit to block duplex construction in terms of parking requirements, and also in terms of some of the permit streamlining bills that the legislature passed at the same time that will hopefully um, increase the rate at which it's feasible to build these duplexes. I am more optimistic about small lot single family, which can be like very similar to duplexes in terms of outcomes, but as we talked about, has some market advantages. But there has been a lot of energy behind getting rid of single family zoning as kind of the headline regulation that makes U.S. land use what it is. So I think it's absolutely symbolically important for states or localities to take this step of eliminating single family zoning. And hopefully, in the Montana case, it will be an economically important reform as well, making these duplexes more feasible to build.
Yeah, no, I think the devil's going to be in the details on implementation there. And I think something I'm always saying that I know you are on board with is reform is a process, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you almost never pass a law that solves the problem. And we're, as I always like to say, we're unpacking 70 years of bad policy, and it takes, you have to iterate over. Um, I, it's funny. In the past, I increasingly feel that process reforms are just important as the actual substantive zoning reforms. So of course, I'm only leaving about 10 minutes to talk about these. Um, but I mean, there were, you mentioned this in your last comment here, is Montana was also doing a lot of stuff to streamline processes. House Bill 2011 streamlining subdivisions, Senate Bill 528, or sorry, Senate Bill 407, putting limits on design review.
Mhm.
There were a lot of small, wonky bills. Is there any in particular that you think are particularly exciting or that you would want to flag for listeners in other states?
Yeah, I believe it was Senate Bill 382 in Montana that strengthens requirements for local comprehensive planning to do a better job of predicting growth and planning for growth, and then requires zoning to be brought in line with the comp plan. So this is often not the case at all. We see comp plans all over the US that say, we're going to take drastic steps to reduce climate change, but we're not going to touch our single family zoning or minimum lot size requirements or parking requirements or anything else. In contrast, Montana cities are now required to adopt zoning rules that actually carry out their comp plans. And then they are required to have a simple permitting process that ensures that projects that comply with this zoning, that complies with the comp plan, are built by right in a timely, and that permits are issued in a timely manner. Um, and we've seen lots of state streamlining efforts that haven't worked well in California in particular. Planning requirements that have been in place for decades have failed to provide the housing that they were intended to, although hopefully that's changing in more recent years. But I think this is a really interesting step in Montana, and hopefully, does a lot to make the permitting process more predictable, cheaper, and faster. This was an interesting bill from a political standpoint as well, because it was basically developed by the executive director of the Montana League of Cities. And in other states, the League of Cities has been primarily an obstructionist force on state laws that are intended to make it easier to build more housing. But in this case, I think partly because of the politics in Montana that said, we are going to do something big on housing this session, like either make a positive contribution or you're not going to be heard, that put the league in a position to spearhead this effort. But I also think this was a case where local officials that, of course, the league represents, they didn't like their own planning process either. They don't want to be reviewing a small subdivision for a year. They want to be practicing something more like what they learned in planning school, um, rather than having these project by project fights. So it was politically popular.
That's a great point. I mean, I think that's an underrated point too, is that often local elected officials are acutely aware of, yes, we know our processes or even some of our zoning rules are a huge barrier to housing production, but local politics just don't line up to fix them at the local level. And I find just as often local elected officials welcome prudent state interventions. And, it's exciting to hear a more productive relationship there. You mentioned, I mean, SB 382, I think, is an interesting one, requiring compliance with the comp plan. I mean, it sounds like just horribly, horribly wonky, even by the standards of zoning policy. But to sort of unpack a little bit of what you said, we often produce these comp plans that, frankly, we can do real public process. We can go out and do real public engagement. And these comp plans will say, we know we need to build X amount of, at least allow X amount of housing to meet our housing demand. And then you look at the zoning code and it's this thing that was written 50 years ago and is far more restrictive and has nothing to do with the comp plan. And if you just have a requirement saying, hey, these things have to be aligned, often that's effectively a mandate to update and liberalize local zoning codes. Small but powerful thing. Another thing I'll say on the subdivision stuff with HB 211, this is another element that I think we're working on here in California. We have SB 684 this year. Same type of thing. All subdivisions beyond like basic lot splits in the US are discretionary, which means they can be long and involve a negotiation and public hearings and sometimes environmental reviews that aren't necessary, especially if this is a small subdivision in an existing urban area. That's another margin of reform that I'm really excited about. We're running out of time here, but big picture on Montana, is there anything that you wanted to flag, or maybe in particular lessons for folks in other states that are looking to potentially emulate the Montana miracle?
Well, going back to the task force, I think this is an incredibly light political lift for any governor or legislator who wants to see housing prioritized in a future session. It doesn't do anything other than say, like, we're going to gather people and develop ideas for reform. But I think if you really think about the politics of who is on the task force and what they are directed to do, it can create the conditions where there are lots of ready-made ideas ready to be put into bills. And then having the task force also create some constituency for the ideas that are in the task force report. So it will have some legislators who are already behind it, industry groups, state agencies who are influential in the housing permitting process. And can really just set the table for making it possible to pass some good ideas.
That's fantastic. I will make one more plug. Welcoming Neighbors Network, I think, is doing a very effective job
Absolutely.
at spreading. So Henry Honoroff is scaling up a lot of these reforms to other states. I want to say I think the Montana reforms, I mean, it's being called the Montana miracle, not without reason. And I think that to the extent that you help to facilitate that, I think it's been really, really valuable for expanding, I think, the scope of what's possible in YIMBY advocacy and basically saying this is not just a coastal thing. This is not just a blue state thing. This is a nationwide crisis, and we need folks, in all different types of states and regions across the country tackling this issue. So I'm excited. I'm also excited about some of your work on ADUs. I mean, I want nationwide ADU legalization, and you are helping to make that happen. Emily, there were about 1,000 different things we could have talked about because you have a lot of amazing work. So hopefully we'll bring you back on. But thanks for coming on to Abundance to chat about Montana.
Thanks so much, Nolan. Great to talk with you as always, and hope we get to do it again.
Cool. Okay.